All right, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Forge of Freedom podcast, live from the NRA annual meeting. We are coming to you a little bit late, as is usual. It takes a little bit of time to do the transition here in the booth, but as you'll notice, I'm here with our guest, our first guest for the day, Jacob Paulsen. Jacob is the president of ConcealedCarry.com, and we're here today to talk about an article that I recently came across of his about 1,600 interactions with law enforcement and some of the lessons that we can take away from that. So with that being said, Jacob, welcome to the Forge of Freedom.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you stopping by. We communicated briefly by email prior to the show, and you were willing to stop by, so I appreciate you stopping by.
No problem.
I gave a brief introduction. You are the president of ConcealedCarry.com. What else are you up to? Just give the viewers a little bit of
That is my whole world, I assure you. day and night, I'm afraid.
What kind of background do you have, and how did you? What was the impetus behind ConcealedCarry.com, and how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah, a lot of evolution. I don't really have a good backstory, man. I wish I had a cool Batman style story, but it was not in the military, not in law enforcement. Just have a real strong feelings about self-defense, and so started out like many people in our industry in the training side. And over time, the business became larger as we started working with more and more instructors across the country, kind of built an instructor network. And then in 2016, we moved to e-commerce, started selling product. And the last several years, we're manufacturers as well. We've purchased a holster company. We have a dry fire product. We manufacture our own shot timers. We got a lot going on, unfortunately. Or better, I don't know. Depends on the day.
There's good and bad to that,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yeah. So this article that we're going to be discussing is called "What Over 1,600 Armed Traffic Stops Reveal About Law Enforcement Interactions."
Yeah.
First of all, what was there some motivating factor or story or anything that brought about the desire to do this?
I think that we forget sometimes, if you do this full time, if you do this for a living, you forget sometimes what it's like to be someone who's a normal, non-full-time, gun guy. And what is that lifestyle about? When you get into concealed carry and you have to deal with these things, what is that about? And I think that this idea of law enforcement confrontation is a big part of the journey, and understanding what am I going to do when I'm confronted by cops, and also understanding what are cops likely to do when they confront me. And you hear anecdotal stories all the time, but I thought, you know what? I'm tired of the advice and the common best practices. I want to understand the data. I want to know what really is going on. So we actually conducted the survey, I think in 2022. I just took forever to get around to putting it. It might have been 2023, but it's several years ago that we conducted the survey, and we sent it out. And it's 1,600 plus traffic stops from about 560 people. So on average, those people are having more than one per person. 2.95 traffic stops per person that responded to the survey.
Which I'm curious, how does that compare to what is average, for the rest of the population? Is this sample?
Yeah, there's
different?
A sample bias, right?
Yeah, okay.
Because first off, in order to get the survey, you have to be on my email list, which I think that our email list is several 100,000 concealed carriers in America, but it's still not representative of all types of concealed carriers. If somebody who's been to our website, has listened to our show, or has bought a product from us or something. And then you have additional bias, because the kind of person who would open that email, the kind of person who would complete the survey is a certain type of person as well. We had actually over 1,000 people complete the survey, but we excluded from the data anybody who had not been stopped by law enforcement when armed. So that was kind of the criteria to the final universe of data, was that you had to say, yes, I've been stopped by law enforcement while I had a gun on me.
Okay.
So that immediately eliminates a lot of people who are just not in the data.
Gotcha. But you still got 1,647 results from 560 people, as you said, and it's 2.95 stops per person. I assume the survey was done asking them about stops throughout their lifetime.
Yes. So, but we captured that in the data. So we asked people, how long have you been carrying concealed? It's a range, right? Less than 2 years, 2 years to 7, whatever it was, and then 10 years plus. And so we're able to estimate the number of years they've been carrying armed, and then divide that by, how many times they say they've been stopped while armed, and we get a rough idea for, however many years per stop, or how many stops per year, which is probably sounds smarter, but actually not the way the data talks, because it's not one per year.
Right.
On average, you're looking at about, you call it 3+ years between stops by a cop with with a gun.
Okay. And this was you came out with approximately 2.95 stops per respondent.
Per respondent in the survey.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. So that sounds like a lot, but it's not really, depending on the time frame that we're talking
Right.
about.
If you're talking about 15 years or something, that's not significant, right?
That's not terribly significant, right?
I think that there's also a huge age bias, by the way. So the younger you are, the more traffic stops you have. So like, if I think about myself, I'm now 40 something. I don't even know. Born in '83. I'm 40. I'm going to be 42 this year. Whew, that was hard. So, if I look at my 20s and 30s, the number of traffic stops I had while armed or at all was significant compared to the last decade and a half.
Right.
Just older, drive more conservatively. Darn that gas mileage or whatever old man thing. But
Exactly.
so yeah, it definitely has a bias toward youth. In terms of traffic stops.
Well, I can relate to the gas mileage issue. I was riding down to the show with my father from Southern Indiana, and we were talking about the difference in the instant mileage reading between 77 miles per hour and 75 miles per hour.
Yeah, it's like, back it up. We're getting an extra 3 miles per gallon here.
That's right, exactly. So let's get into some of the key findings from this survey. What were some of what you thought were some of the most important findings from the survey?
Well, so I'll start with some things I was most surprised by or kind of caught off guard by.
Sure.
I was surprised how infrequently law enforcement disarms the person. My experience, I've been disarmed, 8 times. I've had a cop remove a gun from me in a traffic stop. Like, to me, that's like super normal. Not being disarmed would be unusual.
Interesting.
But it turns out that's not common. Like my experience is unique that way.
Yeah.
So it's 9 point something percent, just shy of 10% of the time, the law enforcement is disarming the individual. So that's pretty high. Like 90% odds, cops not going to even take your gun off of you. Mm-hmm. Not even going to remove it from you.
Right.
Like they've somehow become aware perhaps, but they're not going to disarm you at all. That shocked me. I was like, holy crap, okay, who would have thought?
Yeah. Have you reflected on that at all? Do you look suspicious for some reason?
I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, a lot of it, some of it is also local, and we don't have enough data to bear this out.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, I'll say this, that we know that there are departments and agencies that have policies that say you have to disarm the person.
Yeah.
So, if you live in a place where that's your department, that's what their policy is, then you're going to get disarmed every time, right? But that's, I think, less common. I spent the first 10 to 15 years of my concealed carry life in Utah, where Utah Highway Patrol, Utah State Police, a lot of these guys, they have policies. They have to disarm you. So I was getting disarmed all the time.
Yeah.
But now I live in Colorado, where I don't know that any of the I've yet to find a department that has the policy to disarm. So I think a lot of this is local. Like, well, what's your community's standard? Like, what is the law enforcement there? It's not it's not just what are their options. It's what is their policy. Mm-hmm. They have a department policy.
Right. And I know you consulted with Greg Ellifritz on this a little bit. And Greg Ellifritz, for those who don't know, runs Active Response Training, a blog that's well trafficked and very well respected voice in the firearms training industry. You consulted with him. He's a former law enforcement officer from Ohio, now lives in Texas. What kind of feedback did he give you?
Well, so he actually established the policy for his department in Ohio when concealed carry became a thing in Ohio, which is now many years ago. But he said that the policy they established was basically do not disarm unless you have concern about some potential crime to be committed. In other words, err on the side of leave it alone, right? More gun handling is more bad. So, don't touch unless need to. That was the way he approached it. That's the way he established the policy for his department. And other cops have borne that out as well. I've talked to several other officers. They're like, why would we be choosing to handle guns if we don't have to?
Right. Well, I appreciate that approach. And I think that approach captures this other statement that I've heard made primarily from John Lott, but I've heard it elsewhere as well, where law enforcement are more law-abiding on average than the general population. But somebody who is a concealed carrier, and especially somebody who has a license to carry a concealed firearm or a firearm, depending on open carry, concealed carry, differentiation between states, they are more law-abiding on average than law enforcement. So the odds are that the law enforcement officer stopping you, if you're a lawful concealed carrier, is more likely to commit a crime than that person.
Yeah, I think that bears out, right? That the perception is sort of, hey, like what's this person went to the effort to proactively go through a background check to get education and training, depending on the state. to get this permit.
Yeah, exactly. So that was one of the surprising results or findings of the survey, is that 90% of the time, officers are not going to disarm the person at a traffic stop.
Not concerned enough to pull a gun.
Yep. What were some other surprising findings? And then
here's a shocker. So if we isolate the times when someone does get disarmed, so we look at the 9-point-something% of the time when the officer does disarm the individual, and we look at just that, if that becomes our universe of data, and we then are able to break it out by how were they disarmed. So for example, one option would be the officer physically removed the gun from me. So, maybe I leaned forward, he reached down, grabbed it out of my pants, or I got pulled out of the car, hands on hood, patted down, gun removed, or officer, reached into my console and grabbed the gun, something like that. Another option would be officer removed me from the vehicle because my gun was in the vehicle. So just by removing me, he separated me from the gun. So my gun was in the console, it was in the glove box, whatever. So officer just had me step out, stand over on the side of the street. But another this is the one that really threw me. One of the options was the officer asked me to hand him my gun. Now, I put that in the survey data because I heard a rumor from someone who had heard from someone that it happened to somebody.
Okay.
And I'm like, this sounds ridiculous. Like, what cop in their right mind would be like, will you hand that to me? It sounds like how you get shot. I'm like, you have to be the dumbest cop in the planet.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'll put it in. I almost thought it was silly. I'm like, I'll put it in the survey. Maybe someone out there will say it's happened to them.
Yeah.
No, 18%. 18% of the time when you get disarmed by a cop, which is in our survey, we're talking about like 31 or something incidents reported where the cop said, hand me the gun. Here, grab that and hand it to me. Shocking. I was just like, what?
Yes. So let's do the math on that.
What's going on?
So 1,600 and some odd stops, 10% the officer asks the person to disarm or to
somehow.
Yep. And so that's 160 approximately.
Right.
And then out of those, nearly 20%, the officer asked the person to hand them the gun.
Correct.
Wow.
I was mind blown. I would. Who are these cops?
Yeah.
Like what?
Exactly.
What cop? And Greg Elefritz, Brian Eastridge, all these officers I talked about, they're all like, I would never do that.
Yeah.
I can't. Like if a guy in my department did that, we'd be, he'd get yelled at.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. So, what did those people do? Did you get a sense for that? Did they respond?
No, so we didn't have a really good detailed follow-up if you indicated that you were disarmed that way.
Right.
But here would be my 2 cents. Like, if this happened to me, it's never happened to me. I've been disarmed many times, as I said. But if a cop said, hand me your gun, like, here's my 2 cents from Jacob for whatever you take that value, I would say no.
Yeah.
I'd say, officer, I just really don't feel comfortable handling my gun in front of you. I apologize. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. You're welcome to take it from me if you want to call your supervisor. If you need to get them involved, I'm happy to talk to them, but I'm just really not comfortable touching my gun in front of you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that creates, like you mentioned earlier, an incredible risk of safety to both parties.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Crazy talk. I mean, I can't fathom it.
Yeah.
In fact, we have a couple of documented incidents of people getting shot on traffic stops.
Okay.
Not a lot, doesn't happen often enough, but we have a couple of them, and several of these are on badge cam. So we could go look at those and say, well, what are the things that led up to the person being shot by law enforcement during a traffic stop? And every single one of them is some sort of miscommunication that the individual thought the officer was asking them to handle their gun, and the officer didn't want them to handle their gun. And in the course of them reaching for the gun, officer fired down.
Yeah.
So, yeah, touching a gun sounds like the best way to get shot by a cop.
Right. Yeah, agreed. Totally. So we've talked about a few of the surprising results. What were some of the other maybe surprising results, if there are other surprising results? And then I want to get into some of what you consider to be the most important takeaways from the survey.
So you could call this surprising or important. I'm gonna open it so I have the exact detail. But we asked people, do you live in a state that requires you to notify law enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a thing, right? Do I have an impotence? Do I have a requirement that I have to notify? I get pulled over. Do I have to say, officer, I need to make you aware I have a concealed carry permit and or gun?
Right.
And it's a minority of states that have a requirement like this.
Right.
But we figured, let's ask the question. So we asked. And obviously in the data, we also asked them, what state are you in? So then we can look at that and say, okay, well, what's the accuracy rate? Do people actually know if they are in a state that requires it or not? And that was concerning. So to give you exact data, 20.9, so call it 21%. 21% of people were wrong. So they thought that their state did or didn't, but they were wrong with their answer. They were incorrect. which, by the way, this changed this morning for North Dakota. So the North Dakota governor signed some new legislation this week that changed this. But anyway, at
Changed
the point,
in which way? I'm
in a
curious.
positive way, removed the requirement to notify.
Okay.
So that's interesting. But the challenge is just simply that a significant percentage, to me, 21% of people think that it's one way and it's not in their state.
Well, and I suppose it matters which way they're wrong, right?
Yeah, if you believe that you have a duty to notify but you don't, then you're never going to screw it up.
Right.
But if you think, that you don't have a duty and you do, then that could lead to a potential legal consequence.
Yeah. Did you get a sense for how many out of that 21% were wrong in a bad way? That is, they had a duty to
No,
inform,
I didn't quite pull the data that clearly. I was more concerned just about accuracy generally.
Sure.
But I would suspect that it's a lower chunk that would be wrong the wrong way, only because it's a minority of states that have a duty to inform at all.
Right.
It's super, Nebraska, Texas, Alaska, Hawaii, Louisiana, Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Michigan, Maine, New Jersey. Those are the only states that have a duty to notify.
Right.
So it's a relatively short list.
Okay. So when you were creating this survey, did you just create this out of your own mind from whole cloth, or did you consult with somebody about this, about how to?
Nope.
What to ask?
This is totally off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. We talked about some of the surprising and important. What other takeaways do you think people should know about?
There's a lot of. One thing we did is we mapped the data. We don't have significant enough data to be able to clearly say, well, this part of the country or in this state, you're more likely or less likely to get pulled over. Just the data doesn't. It's the sample is not large enough. But that said, for the data we do have, it's worth noting perhaps that there's no trend by state or region. So it's not like in Alaska this is more likely to happen, or in Florida you're more likely to be disarmed, or people in New Jersey are less likely to have that. There's just no real pattern at all that's geographic as far as we could tell. So I think that's relevant.
One thing that didn't even occur to me before I read this article, you asked about the perception that having a license to carry or a permit might reduce the odds of receiving a traffic citation. I didn't even know that was a thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think this is interesting because I definitely have heard enough anecdotal stories from people who say things like, oh, the cop thanked me for having a gun and sent me on my way. In fact, I have on more than one occasion, maybe not as recently, but certainly in my early concealed carry days, heard people describe concealed carry permit as a license to speed. So it's sort of like, well, how really true is that? And unfortunately, the survey, we can't determine whether or not the cop did or was not influenced to give a citation based on whether or not the person had a permit. Right? There's no way for us to know. But what we could certainly ask is, was it your impression that the cop was less likely to give a citation, more likely to give a citation, et cetera? And so we did. We asked that question. And I do think the results are kind of interesting. So to kind of give you the breakdown, 1.4%, so that's a very low percentage, felt like they were more likely to get a citation for having the gun. That's really kind of, I would not have expected that, but it's a low percentage, 1.4%, not significant. The next biggest group, 15.2%, had no opinion. They're like, well, I just didn't get a sense for that one way or the other. Was the cop more or less like, I don't know, kind of thing. 17.9% less likely to get citations. So this is the group of people who are like, man, the cop was like, he was ready to go, and then he found out I had a gun, and he changed the demeanor, right? Like, no, we're good, not giving this dude a ticket. 18%, and then of course the biggest percentage, 65.5%, no impact. Like just had no impact. Like it just didn't matter. Like it clearly did not matter. So definitely, I think. I guess my perception of this would be, I think we would assume that a good officer doing his job would not be influenced by your gun on giving you a citation or not. And the data would bear out then that if that's the case, the perception of the concealed carrier is that most cops are not influenced. Okay. I mean, in a significant way, like 80% feel like there's no impact.
Right. Interesting. Well, that would be my perception. I can see how some might have that perception. Going back to the discussion about locality matters, sure. I can see that. If you live in a small town with the sheriff's department and you're familiar with the deputies and they know you're a gun guy, you're a good guy, they might be less likely to and
political things, right? Like officers in New Jersey are going to have different cultural reference point than officers in Montana.
Now, you said you were stopped, I think, was it 5 times? personally?
I've been stopped a lot of times, at least 10.
And on occasions when you were disarmed, I mean.
Well, I think five, 6, 7 times for sure.
And some of those were in Utah?
Well, most of them were in Utah.
Okay, and then any in Colorado?
I don't think I've ever been disarmed in Colorado.
Okay, but on none of those occasions did the officer ask you?
Never.
Okay.
Never happened to me.
Never.
I've had officers physically remove things from me many times. That's most common. I've been pulled out of the car, patted down. I've been told to put my hands on the ceiling of the car, and they just reach in and grab a gun out of my pants. I've had that happen multiple times. I've had the officer say, "I'm going to go back to my car. When I come back, I would like your gun to be on the passenger seat, and I'll grab it through the window." I've had a lot of those kinds of things.
And were these in states that had a duty to inform, or
No.
did you voluntarily?
Voluntarily.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, that's what I want to get into next. I assume that would be your advice to most people is, even in a state where there is no duty to inform the officer at a stop, what's your advice for people, whether or not they should inform? Obviously, they should if they're in a duty to inform.
Yeah, but if you're in a place with no duty to inform, then I'd say the first, I think there's a prerequisite question to answer it, and that is the officer likely to find out without me telling them? Because if the officer is not likely to find out, if they're not going to, run your driver's license or your registration and have it pop up on this guy's got a concealed carry permit, if they're not going to find out unless I tell them, I advise you don't tell them anything. It only complicates the stop. It adds potential risk for the officer, certainly the perception of risk. It potentially drains law enforcement resources. A lot of these agencies and departments have policies about not being able to proceed alone. So I've been pulled over to inform the officer I had a firearm. He said, "I'll be right back." And I'm waiting for 15, 20 minutes wondering why, and then 4 more cops roll up. And then he comes up, pulls me out, pats me down. We got other officers, on flashlights, helping with the contact, maintaining safety, put me in the back of the squad car, run my info, pull me out, give me a warning, and tell me to have a nice day. It's like it took 5 patrol vehicles to give me a warning today.
Wow.
So I think it's unnecessary risk. It's unnecessary resource. I just think it's not in your best interest to inform the officer if there's no chance of them finding out any other way.
Okay.
But the question to ask is, do I live in a place where either because the state or the county or whatever thing, policy, procedure, software, database, solution, etc., that they're going to find out anyway? Because the answer is yes, then crap. You want them to hear from you, not the computer.
Do you know, or do you have a sense for how many states? I assume the law enforcement officer, when he conducts the traffic stop, is able to tell whether or not the person has a license to carry a firearm.
I would say more often than not, but I've not researched that exhaustively to have a real strong data on that. So if you live in Arkansas, I just have no clue. Mm-hmm. I really don't know. But I'll tell you something that complicates this. Is there some states? Where are you guys from? Indiana. Right? So Indiana is a good example where you walk into Indiana and you apply for your permit at a county sheriff's office, mm-hmm. and it's issued by the county, but it's a state permit.
It's issued by the state, but you have to pay the county a fee.
But the county runs the background check. The county processes it.
Correct.
You have to renew it with the county sheriff. I mean, the whole program is run by the sheriff's office, but you're getting a state permit.
Correct.
Issued by the state,
issued
via the county.
The state, right.
Yeah. So that's a very different environment than, say, we mentioned Utah, or we could talk about Virginia or Florida, where you're actually applying for the permit through a state agency.
Okay.
And the state agency runs a background check. The state agency. So there's a difference between, I live in a state where each county is basically, by law, maintaining a list of people with a permit. Each county is the one getting the money, the application fee, the renewal fee, the background check fees, etc., versus a state where it's like, no, this is like the counties are not involved at all. This is 100% at the state level. Because if it's run by the state level, I'd say the odds of the officer finding out are higher. Because there's some sort of universal statewide database. A lot of this is about software and a lot of this is about money. And then some of it's about politics. You might be in a state, this is not crazy, this is true. You might be in a state where, this county sheriff doesn't like this county sheriff, and so this county sheriff refuses to share information with that county sheriff, and so you get pulled over in this county and they can't pull up your permit. But you get pulled over in that county and they can't. So
interesting.
The point is, sometimes it's a very simple, easy answer to that question. Sometimes it's more nuanced and more complex.
Okay. How many, if any, law enforcement responded to your survey? Do you know? Did you?
Yes, because actually because at the very end of the survey, we had an open-ended question, like, hey, share a story, tell us what happened to you, kind of thing. And so there's enough of those that are from cops, like, well, as an officer, when I pulled people over, da-da-da-da-da-da. Not a ton, though. I'd say the minority, and there might have been a dozen or so people that responded to that survey that are cops. Since publishing the article, we've had a lot of comments from cops.
Okay.
A lot is relative. I'd say 3 or 4. So I'd say very few.
Okay. So you've gotten some feedback.
Yes, for sure.
What has that feedback been like? What sort of feedback have you gotten?
All over the board.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I've had some texts and calls from some cops too that have been interesting. One officer told me that he's in a department where they had to disarm, and he couldn't do it alone. He's like, he said most of the time in his department, there's a rural area, so they would patrol alone, not in partnerships. He said, as soon as I found out there was a gun, immediately had to call for backup. Once backup shows up, we had to disarm.
That's interesting. Was that in a state that had a duty to inform? Do you know?
No, it was not a state that had a duty to inform.
Interesting. Because part of my concern when I talk to people is I think that insofar as the officer has no reasonable suspicion of any sort of criminal activity or degree of concern for officer safety, it's none of his business whether or not you've got a firearm. So having a policy that says it is their business, does he ask, or was it just a policy that they had to disarm if they became aware?
If they became aware.
Okay.
And it's worth mentioning that there's we have a couple different flavors. So far we've talked about it in a very binary way. The state either has a policy that you have to inform or a policy that you don't have to inform. And it's a little bit more nuanced. So you have states that have a duty to inform, like you might proactively volunteer the info. You have states that you only have to inform if asked, which is an interesting nuance. And we have about 4 or 5 of these states. So the situation is, if the officer says, well, but do you have a firearm? You can't say, officer, I'm not submitting to that line of questioning, constitutional rights kind of thing. Like, no, that state's policy is if they ask you, now you have a legal duty to tell them yes or no. So that's an interesting nuanced version of this, right?
Right.
And then you also have states, and this is by far I'll call it the very minority of states, the least likely, are states where you have no duty to inform, even if asked. So like very specifically in the statute, like at no point do you ever have to inform law enforcement you have a firearm. So if they say, you can't lie. Lying to a law enforcement officer is its own crime, right? But excuse me, sir, are you armed? Do you have a concealed carry permit, anything like that? Officer, I'm not submitting to that line of questioning. Like I don't have to answer your question.
Yeah.
Like that's an option in a very few number of states. So it's worth noting that there's just some nuance. It's not binary, one or the other.
Right. So what sort of takeaways do you think there are in terms of training and in terms of things that people should consider when they're stopped by a law enforcement officer?
So one that we didn't talk about that is in the survey and worth going and seeing in the article is how you choose to inform. So I think what's clear, what the clear, consistent best practice is we do not want law enforcement officers to watch us root through things, going through pockets, reaching behind us, going into the glove box, the console. So the two kind of seems to be best practices are either A, before the officer is at your window, already have retrieved the documentation, already have the permit and or the registration, the insurance, whatever the things are that the officer is going to need. Maybe that's kept in the visor, so it's somewhere I can kind of reach without looking like I'm getting a gun. Maybe I keep it in the car door. But regardless, kind of having it ready to go, maybe on the dash in my hand by the time the officer gets to the window. If that's not an option, if that's not a reality, then I think we want to discourage officers at the window talking to me, and I start reaching for things. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're a gun guy like me, like it would take very little time for you to look through my car window and figure out this guy's probably got a gun, right? I got HK stickers up on the stuff. I mean, it would be a mess. So the secondary best practice is sort of reach for nothing, like doing a roll down window and just use words. Officer, I just want to let you know I have a concealed handgun permit and I'm armed. How would you like me to proceed? What do you want me to do next? So I think that's the most important thing is sort of like, well, if you feel like you want to inform, and I'm in a place where I always inform because the computer's going to tell them. So I'm going to tell them because I'd rather be the one. So I choose to proactively inform. So how do I do it? Well, I choose to do it verbally. You might say a lot of people, like the number one response to the survey is I hand them my permit along with my driver's license. Okay, but if you're on that side of the fence, that's fine. But I would say have that ready before the officer gets to the window. I would not be going, reaching for my wallet, getting stuff out of the glove box in front of the officer. That I would strongly discourage. So I think, does my state have a duty? Yes, no. If there is no duty, do I have good reason to tell them because it's better for them to hear from me than the computer? Is the computer going to tell them, in other words? And then follow up that, what's going to be my process? How am I going to put the officer on notice? Am I going to hand them the permit? Am I just going to tell them verbally? If I want to hand them stuff, then how am I going to stage that stuff in the car so I can be more prepared and do it quickly?
I like that point. I like all of your points, but I'm glad you mentioned how are you going to stage the stuff in your car so that you can do it quickly, because one thing I've noticed, I'm a criminal defense attorney, I've seen a number of police reports where the police report notes that I noticed suspicious movement in the car while the officer was still in his patrol vehicle.
Absolutely.
So, and that movement, if you're, bending down or reaching across to the opposite floorboard or even to the glove box, if it's a long way and like a big truck or something, they may perceive that movement, that significant movement, as reaching for a weapon or reaching for something that they might have some concern about. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about that in terms of how are you going to retrieve those
how do you stage the stuff?
Yeah.
I think this is critical too, because, and this might be a really important thing to communicate, most of us just have no concept for the mentality of a law enforcement officer on a contact, right? I mean, I've never had a badge. I've done some ride-alongs. I have some friends that are cops, but most of us, we just don't, like this officer might have just come on duty, sure. If he just came on duty, he might have just sat through a briefing where he was forced to watch 5 body cam videos of traffic stops, one of which some guy on the other side of the country who got shot by a shotgun. So how does that change his approach when he's like, crap, now I got to go talk to this dude I just pulled over. I just this morning had to watch a video of some dude getting hit by a shotgun while he was doing the same thing I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I just came from a domestic incident, right, where we had to put some dude in cuffs because he was trying to stab his ex-wife or something. Like, I think we don't totally grasp the mentality of the situation that they're in.
Are there any things that you think you missed out on in the survey or want to follow up on in the survey in some way?
Yes. So most of that, I would like to go back and just get more data. So I'm interested in expanding the data pool, working with some other people who have additional access to audience to see if we can get a little bit deeper data. But I would like to be able to break down some things I was unable to segment. So I'm curious about segmenting location along with frequency of getting pulled over, along with perceived policies. The policy is actually a big one. There's one thing to say this is what the officer did. It's nothing to say, are you aware of the officer's policy? And another one I'm really curious about, and you brought it up as well, is I would like to know, does the average concealed carrier have any idea if the computer is going to inform the officer or not? Like you said, you proactively inform. Why?
Yeah.
Like why would you do that?
Right.
Is it because you think that they're going to find out anyway, or you just were told to? And I'd say most people probably because they were told to. But I'd like to understand, like, what do you perceive to be the information the officer is going to have access to?
Yeah. I think Masad Ayub, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike's sitting over here across the table. I'll give him a microphone so he can chime in. But my perception, or at least what I recall from Masad Ayub, is that he encourages people to voluntarily inform, but in a way, like you say, that is carefully constructed and curated so that you don't put the officer who might already be on edge because he's coming from a domestic situation or has had a bad experience at a traffic stop before, whatever the case may be, because many officers know, and this depends on locality again, because many officers know if you've got a license, you're probably a good guy, and that's going to put them at ease. Now,
well, on top of that too, this assumes, first of all, I think the officers now in today's modern society with regard to technology, I think in Indiana, for instance, if you've got a license to carry a handgun, which is what we call it, the officer's going to see that before he or she gets out of the car. But what's also of interest is whether or not these police officers, and this is more of a question than anything, just because somebody has a permit or a license to carry a handgun, does that mean they really have a firearm? Because my perception is most people with a permit don't carry.
Yeah.
So that's another.
You also bring up another nuanced point, which would be, best practice to inform could also be dependent on whether or not you're armed.
Yeah.
Right. So I might tell someone, hey, if you have no gun on you, it might be more in your interest to proactively inform than if you're armed. Because if you tell the officer, hey, I do have a concealed carry permit, but I'm not armed, there's no firearms in the vehicle, I just want to let you know I have a permit. Now I'm getting the benefit of I must be a good person without any of the potential downside of there's a gun in this car and you might have some procedural things you have to do now.
Right.
That put you at risk, me at risk, or resources of the department. And so that's very different from, dude, I got a gun.
Yes.
So anyway, I think that I'll give you one other quick thought that I think is really critical in this context, and I'll call it scripting. When I get pulled over, you need to understand that it's not a high stress environment for me at all. Like I love it. I think it's fantastic. I got questions for the cop. I want to know if they've been issued the gun. All sorts of things.
It's part of an ongoing research project
right.
for you.
It's like this is life, and frankly, I don't have a lot of respect for traffic laws. So it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
It's just part of my life. But for most people, it's a high stress environment, right? Heart rate increases. You're getting endorphins into the bloodstream at a higher heart rate. So it tends to be a high stress environment. If you know that's you, if you're a high, man, when the cops show up, my heart starts pounding, the blue lights, I freak out. Then it probably is worth you scripting in advance 2 things. These are things I think should be scripted. The first one is, how am I going to inform? So if it's like, oh, I know I need to inform him. So officer, I got to, the first things out of your mouth are, I got a gun. That's probably not as good as, officer, I wanted to let you know that I have been issued a concealed carry permit and I'm armed, right? Very different kind of environment, the way we communicate. So kind of scripting that response, I think, is important. The other one, and this is probably less considered, is how to respond to, where is the gun? The officer asking, where's the gun? Which, by the way, this is in the survey data. We asked, we kind of had a list of like 12 things. We said, did the cop do any of these 12 things? Let's sort of select all that apply. And one of them was, ask me where my gun was. Decent response rate to that one. So I'd say that you have decent odds. I would not rule it out. I'd say it's probably going to happen to you that they're going to ask where the gun is. So what's the most natural way to respond when someone asks you where something is? Point, show, grab, right? Oh, it's right here, officer, right?
Yeah.
Like that is not in your best interest. We all know that already, but it's a high stress environment, right? You're panicking, you're freaking out. So I would script, how am I going to inform them? And I would script, how am I going to describe where my gun is? Officer, it's in my waistband in the front, about 1 o'clock to the right, appendix carry. That's highly specific, described in several ways. And I don't have to point, I don't have to show, I don't have to pull up my shirt, I don't have to point the gun. It's all clean.
What things haven't we discussed that you think people should know that maybe we haven't covered? And then I want to, after we talk about that, just close with you plugging concealedcarry.com.
Sure. 2 thoughts. See if I can remember both. First, it changes the dynamic dramatically when you're traveling outside of your own state. So, you probably you've done some research, in my state, this is what cops do. In my state, this is how it works. This is what their computer's going to tell them. This is what my instructor advised me to do when I get in this situation. Now, one day you've traveled across. I'm in Georgia right now. I haven't been in Georgia since, I don't even know, 2013 or something. So, okay, what do I do if I'm out of state? So I would think that changes some things. Certainly, I would want to do some research. Does this state have a duty to inform, things like that? You should probably download the concealedcarry.com app. It'll have all that in there. But more importantly, do a little bit of research. And that might be a place where I'm even less likely to volunteer information. I might say, well, in my own state, I'm proactively inform the officer, but here I am in Georgia. I've checked. There's no duty to inform, so I can't get in trouble if I don't. And because there's any potential nuanced things that I'm unaware of that are different here relative to law enforcement or cultural things or policies or procedures or computers and all the things, I'm going to be less likely to bring up the topic. So I think that's pretty important to consider. I had another one. I had 2 things. That was one of them, travel and something else really smart, I think.
Well, maybe it'll come back to you. Why don't you plug concealedcarry.com?
Concealedcarry.com. So concealedcarry.com is attempting to be your one-stop shop for all relevant concealed carry resources. So I just mentioned we have a mobile app. It's meant to be kind of a legal resource library to be able to research gun laws in all states. We are an e-commerce business, so we sell, something like 1,000 products from lots of different name brands you're familiar with. We also are manufacturers. We have our own product line. So KSG Armory Holsters is our product. Barrel Block is our product. Range Tech Shot Timers is our product. Mountain Man Medical is one of our biggest brands. So a lot of trauma gear and do a lot of training related to that. We appreciate people who read the blog and listen to the podcasts and watch the YouTube videos and all the things.
So did this start out as a one-man show? Or
Yes.
Yeah. How many people do you have working with you now?
9, I think. I think we're at 9 right now.
Okay. Including all the e-commerce stuff? Or?
Oh, correct.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Well, it sounds like a pretty efficient operation.
Or it's just not as big as it sounds.
Yeah.
Maybe a little both.
Either way. Did the second point come back to you, or did travel? And if not, it's okay.
It was something that Mike said too that he gave me this great idea, and I was like, "That's critical. We got to talk about that."
Yeah, but about simplifying the process, the script, the planning for the stop.
Well, I think that there's some things we take for granted that the average person just knows, like roll down the window, keep your hands on the wheel, keep your hands visible, turn off the car, take the keys out of the ignition. These are all things that are just good, plain, simple advice that I think that sometimes we take for granted that the average person is aware of that.
Yeah.
I remember.
There we go.
Record it.
Okay.
Record it. You guys are attorneys.
Yeah.
So you guys can, you might have a strong opinion about this, but in most, as far as I know, all 50 states, I researched this once. In all 50 states, we have at least a single-party consent law. So if one party to any given conversation is aware that it's being recorded, that it's legal. I'm not aware of any states where there's a necessary 2-party consent law.
Yeah.
So research on your own. I'm not a lawyer, these guys are, but I would be inclined, if you have concerns, to always record a conversation. And then here's the worst case scenario, and this is the main thing I want to talk about. The worst case, if something just is bad, you're uncomfortable, they asked you to hand them the gun, for example, and you just heard this crazy Jacob guy online say never do that, it's going to hell in a handbag. You're like, I'm just not comfortable with the situation. There's some good key language you should be aware of. The first one is, I'd like to talk to a supervisor. All patrol officers have a supervisor that's on shift, right? The shift supervisor who is available to roll out to a scene and deal with the situation. So it's like, man, I just think this cop, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's making me uncomfortable. He wants to do this, that, the other thing. You know what? I'm asking for the supervisor. So that's good key, like, cop language that you can leverage that is consistently probably going to make this cop really upset because you're going to make him look bad in front of his boss. But it's going to get you access to somebody with a higher level of training and a higher level of liability, frankly, in terms of doing the right thing and knowing what the policies are. So don't be afraid to ask for a supervisor if you need to. And if you're really concerned, like I said, record it.
Well, Jacob, I really appreciate you taking the time to stop by the booth. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the article. I encourage everybody to go and check out the article as well. Again, it was, let's see, what over 1,600 armed traffic stops reveal about law enforcement interactions. It was just posted a few weeks ago, April 14th, 2025. So go check that out at concealedcarry.com. All right.
There you go.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Yep.